The untouchable king didn't just crack, he shattered. Standing in the threshold of a forced-open elevator, Kang Jinhyuk, the man who owned the city's skyline, was kneeling on the cold marble, his tailored silk shirt wrinkled by the hands of a man who had finally realized that an empire is just a hollow box without the woman who holds its heart. The silence of the Shinhwa Tower penthouse had changed. It was no longer the meaningful silence of a master and his servant, but the deafening roar of a man's pride finally hitting the floor. As Amara Cole looked down at the hand Jinhyuk had thrust between the closing sensors, she saw the visual proof of a total internal collapse. For 4 months, she had been a permanent but invisible fixture. Now, she was the only person with the power to either save the king or let the elevator doors finish the job of cutting him out of her life forever. Welcome to Korean Mafia Love Tales, your ultimate destination for gripping stories of the Korean Mafia, underworld power, and forbidden interracial romance. Dive into thrilling mafia tales filled with dangerous love, betrayal, obsession, and passion set in the dark and mysterious underworld. Our stories feature powerful Korean mafia bosses, strong female leads, and intense romantic connections that cross cultures and boundaries. If you love mafia romance, Korean drama vibes, billionaire love stories, and underworld tales, this channel is for you. Subscribe for weekly uploads of addictive mafia stories, Korean underworld romance, love tales, and dramatic storytelling that will keep you hooked till the end. If you want to see how this story goes, stay with me until the very end. And as we begin, hit that like button and tell me in the comments what you think about this story. The silver panels of the elevator groaned under the mechanical protest as Jinhyuk's hand remained anchored between the sensors, his precise movements abandoned for a raw, desperate lunging. He stood in the threshold of the glass fortress, his silhouette no longer the sharp image of a controlled king, but that of a man undergoing a total, internal collapse. The meaningful silence that had once acted as a wall between them was now thick with his gravelly plea. "I'm telling you that without you, this empire is just a cold, empty box," he rasped, his piercing eyes tracking Amara with a shock he could no longer mask. He wasn't speaking of Rule 1 or the appropriate lines of their previous contract. Instead, he offered a truth revealed. He wanted her to stay not as an overlooked worker or a fixture of his convenience, but as his equal. "Stay," he whispered, the command lacking its usual certainty and being replaced by an authentic, grounded pain. "Not as a worker, as the woman who owns the heart I was too afraid to show you." Amara gripped the handle of her suitcase, her athletic frame framed by the cold metallic gleam of the doors, as she studied the man who had finally learned that love was not a hostile takeover. The visual proof of his failure, the bloodshot intensity in his gaze, held her steady. The sudden chime of Jinhyuk's encrypted phone shattered the moment. It was his senior advisors, frantic over the $4 billion acquisition that hung in the balance. They had seen the crack in his armor during the boardroom meeting and were demanding he return to the strategic thinking that defined his reign. Without breaking eye contact with Amara, Jinhyuk answered the call. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp as he gave a final, precise command. He didn't ask for a moment. He terminated their positions effective immediately. He fired the very men who had witnessed his vulnerability, choosing to burn the bridges to his old world to build a new one with her. He was prioritizing the warmth of her presence over the underworld power of a multi-billion-dollar deal. As he tossed the phone onto the sterile marble floor, he showed he was jealous, but not loud, willing to trade his untouchable crown for the chance to start over. The silence that followed was no longer a cage. It was the first brick in a bridge built on her worth. Amara looked at the hand Jinhyuk had thrust between the sensors, then back at the man who had finally admitted his empire was a cold, empty box without her. She didn't release the handle of her suitcase immediately, her calm, grounded expression holding the moment in a delicate balance. "1 week," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet confidence that redrew the appropriate lines of their relationship. "I will stay for 7 days, not as your cook and not under a contract. I stay as a guest, to see if the man who broke those doors is the man you are actually becoming, or if this is just another hostile takeover of a heart you think you can own. Jinhyuk's piercing eyes filled with an authentic, grounded pain as he withdrew his hand, the silver doors finally sliding shut with a soft hiss. He stood in the glass fortress, a controlled king who had just resigned his crown to earn a partnership he had never before bothered to understand. The meaningful silence between them shifted from a wall to a bridge as they walked away from the elevator, though the air remained thick with the scent of filtered rain and unspoken truths. The fragile peace of the first evening was shattered not by a command, but by the melodic chime of the security intercom. Jinhyuk's sharp jawline locked as the screen near the elevator flickered to life, displaying a familiar face in the lobby. It was Ethan Hayes, the approachable man with the warm smile that Jinhyuk had come to loathe. Ethan stood with another massive bouquet of crimson roses, a visual proof of affection that felt like a physical strike to Jinhyuk's chest. He was there to check on Amara, his presence a direct, visual strike to Jinhyuk's burgeoning jealousy. Jinhyuk went alarmingly still, his internal collapse deepening as he watched Amara move toward the intercom with a knowing smile. The untouchable king felt the bite of a jealous internal collapse as he realized that while he had provided a fortress, Ethan offered the emotional availability Amara actually craved. As Amara spoke into the intercom, her voice, clearer and more vibrant than it ever was with him, Jinhyuk realized the week ahead would be his greatest strategic endgame, one where his billions meant nothing against a man secure enough to be kind. The atmosphere in the Shinhwa Tower boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and a pressurized silence that had turned predatory. Across the polished obsidian table, the delegates from the European Consortium watched the empty head chair with a cold, calculated patience. Sensing that the strategic thinker was finally compromised, they launched a coordinated, hostile takeover, moving to strip Jinhyuk of the very power that had acted as his velvet hammer for years. His senior advisors exchanged panicked glances as the logistics of the $4 billion acquisition began to unravel, the leverage shifting away from the man who had always been the controlled king. Yet, 43 floors above the chaos, Jinhyuk remained alarmingly still in the heart of his glass fortress. For the first time in his career, he ignored the agonizing precision of the corporate clock, refusing to answer the frantic chimes of his security intercom. He was no longer the untouchable king, obsessed with a billion-dollar portfolio. Instead, he was a man focused on a microscopic glitch in his own perfection. He spent the afternoon in the kitchen, a space he had once treated as an operating theater, watching Amara with intense eyes that no longer looked right through her. Instead of demanding Rule 3 and waiting for her to anticipate his needs, Jinhyuk stood by the marble island, his tall, athletic frame cast in a shadow of uncharacteristic humility. He moved with precise movements, but they were redirected toward a new, strategic endgame, learning the exact toasted aroma of the barley tea she had recently stopped making for him. He watched the way she moved with a rhythmic independence, no longer the invisible ghost of his convenience. For the first time, he didn't wait for a request. He reached for the ceramic pot, his hand hesitating as he tried to remember the silk-smooth ritual she had perfected over 120 days. By choosing to anticipate her needs rather than his own, Jinhyuk was effectively redrawing the appropriate lines of his world. He was letting his empire burn on the streets below, realizing that a meaningful silence built on her presence was worth more than $1 billion hostile takeover. He was finally seeing the woman he had taken for granted, choosing to be a partner in the quiet of their home rather than a king in a hollow boardroom. The air in the glass fortress was alarmingly still as Ethan Hayes stepped out of the elevator, his tailored smart casual blazer and warm smile a stark human contrast to the sterile, expensive ozone of Jinhyuk's world. Jinhyuk stood by the mezzanine balcony, his tall, athletic frame rigid, his intense eyes tracking the man who had dared to offer Amara the visual proof of affection he had treated as a weakness. He had intended this meeting to be a strategic endgame of dominance and obedience, a way to re-establish the appropriate lines of his empire. Instead, the controlled king found himself anchored to the floor as Ethan spoke, not with the stuttering fear of a subordinate, but with the confidence of a man who was secure enough to be kind. "You built her a cage and called it safety, Jinhyuk," Ethan said, his voice grounded and confident. "But a woman like Amara doesn't need a contract or a fortress to feel seen. She needs someone to ask how her day was, not just what she's cooking. She needs the emotional availability you threw away because you thought owning everything meant owning the heart inside her." Jinhyuk's sharp jawline locked, a jealous internal collapse vibrating through his chest as the simple truth cut through his strategic thinking. He looked around at his sprawling, empty palace, at the seamless brushed steel and the soundproof walls, and for the first time, the meaningful silence felt like a sentence rather than a shield. He had spent months looking right through her, categorizing her as a permanent but invisible fixture, while another man had been building a bridge to her heart. As Ethan described a life of shared thoughts and approachable warmth, Jinhyuk felt the weight of a devastating loss. In his pursuit of a $4 billion acquisition and absolute underworld power, he had become the poorest man in the city, a man who owns everything but has no one to share his soul with. The untouchable king stood paralyzed, realizing that his power was useless against a rival who didn't need an empire to be emotionally available. The physical transformation of the Shinhwa Tower penthouse began not with a renovation plan, but with the violent, rhythmic shattering of the glass fortress. Jinhyuk, no longer the controlled king of his silent domain, had ordered the removal of the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows that had once defined Amara's world. As the glass was hauled away, the sterile, expensive ozone of the filtered air was replaced by the raw, unpredictable breeze of the Seoul night. The barrier that made Amara feel like a ghost in a cage was gone, leaving the penthouse open, vulnerable, and for the first time breathing. The operating theater of a kitchen remained dark and silent that evening. There was no silk-smooth rice porridge simmering on the stove, and no perfectly seared sea bass being plated with an extra sprig of thyme. Instead, the untouchable king had ordered food from a local kitchen, the kind of approachable meal Ethan Hayes might have suggested. They sat at the mahogany table, but the appropriate lines of their contract had been completely erased. Jinhyuk did not sit at the head like a controlled king awaiting service. He sat directly across from Amara, their meaningful silence no longer a wall but a fragile open bridge. His piercing eyes, usually fixed on fluctuating market stocks, were now intense and grounded as they focused entirely on her. For the first time in 120 days, he didn't wait for her to anticipate his needs. He didn't look for the crumbs she left behind to understand her. He reached across the table, his sharp jawline softened by an authentic, grounded pain. "What are you thinking, Amara?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that lacked any hint of command. The question hung in the air, more significant than any $4 billion acquisition. He wasn't asking about the logistical synergies of his empire or what she was preparing for his guests. He was asking to meet the woman he had taken for granted. Amara looked at him, her warm skin glowing in the unfiltered light of the city, realizing that the king had finally resigned. In the absence of the glass walls, she was no longer an invisible fixture or a high-end appliance. She was his equal, finally being seen in the home that had finally become a sanctuary. The removal of the floor-to-ceiling windows had invited the city in, but it had also signaled a perceived vulnerability to the predators watching from the shadows. Within the dark corners of the Seoul underworld, Jinhyuk's newfound kindness was not seen as a transformation of the soul, but as a threat to his empire, a fatal internal collapse of the strategic thinker they once feared. To his rivals, the untouchable king had finally shown a crack in his armor, and they moved with the pressurized silence of a high-stakes strike. The breach happened at 7:02 p.m., the exact hour the glass fortress usually hummed with agonizing precision. The security intercom did not chime with a melodic warning. Instead, the soundproof walls were bypassed by a strategic override that plunged the mezzanine into a suffocating, alarmingly still darkness. For the first time, the high-tech cage was no longer a sanctuary, but a hostile environment where the appropriate lines of safety had been erased. Amara stood in the center of the kitchen, Her athletic frame, tense as the air, once smelling of filtered rain, suddenly turned heavy with the pressurized heat of an intrusion. Shadowed figures moved through the open-plan dining area, their predatory patience finally reaching its endgame. Jinhyuk emerged from the mezzanine, his tall, athletic silhouette no longer the image of a controlled king, giving commands from a distance. He moved with precise movements and a commanding presence, but his intense eyes were fixed solely on Amara's safety. He had to prove he could protect someone like her without reverting to the man who treated her as a high-end appliance. As he intercepted the first threat near the mahogany table, he didn't use her as a ghost to be hidden away. He fought with a low, dangerous rasp, his athletic frame coiled like a spring, ensuring he remained the shield between her and the underworld violence. He was jealous, but not loud, his internal collapse having forged a new kind of strength. He wasn't just defending his empire, he was protecting the truth revealed in her eyes. In the chaos, he finally demonstrated that he could offer safety without a contract or a cage, treating her not as a prisoner of his fortress, but as the partner he was finally ready to earn. The alarmingly still darkness of the penthouse was not a void, but a canvas upon which Amara Cole finally drew her own appropriate lines. As the strategic override by Jinhyuk's rivals sent the high-tech systems into a mechanical protest, she did not wait for the untouchable king to descend from the mezzanine as her savior. Instead, she moved through the operating theater of the kitchen with a rhythmic independence, her athletic frame coiled with a calm confidence that the men in the shadows had never been taught to fear. She didn't need a contract to understand the glass fortress. She had spent 4 months as its ultimate observer, mapping its vulnerabilities through the meaningful silence of her daily routine. While Jinhyuk engaged the first wave of intruders near the mahogany table, Amara reached the primary control hub. Her warm skin was illuminated by the flickering emergency lights as her fingers moved over the interface with precise movements. She didn't look for his commands or his permission. With a series of strategic keystrokes, she bypassed the breach, re-establishing the soundproof walls and trapping the intruders in a pressurized lockdown of her own making. The internal collapse of the security grid was halted not by the controlled king, but by the woman he had treated as a permanent but invisible fixture. As the filtered rain of the ventilation system kicked back into life, Amara stood her ground, the visual proof of her competence hanging in the heavy silence. She was no longer the cook or a high-end appliance of his convenience. By managing the crisis with her own military-grade eyes, she proved that her self-respect was the most effective shield in the building. Jinhyuk went alarmingly still as he realized the safety he thought he provided was a fantasy compared to the power she carried within herself. She had found her worth in the heat of the conflict, and as she met his intense, piercing eyes, the truth revealed was undeniable. The king didn't need to protect her. He needed to be worthy of standing beside her. The pressurized silence of the Shinhwa boardroom had returned, but the leverage had shifted irrevocably. Across the polished obsidian table, the remaining board members sat like predators, their intense eyes fixed on Jinhyuk as they delivered their ultimatum. To save the $4 billion acquisition and stop the hostile takeover by the European consortium, they demanded he return to the controlled king he once was. He was told to reclaim his precise movements and cold authority, which meant reinforcing the appropriate lines and the glass fortress that had turned his home into a cage. They wanted the strategic thinker who treated people as high-end appliances, not a man compromised by a woman who had found her worth. Jinhyuk stood by the window, his tall, athletic frame casting a long shadow over the legal documents that represented his empire. He looked at the city's skyline, then back at the reflection of the man who had once thought he owned everything, while having no idea who this woman was. He realized that the dominance and obedience he had cultivated were useless in a world of emotional availability and meaningful silence. Without a commanding presence or a low, dangerous rasp, he reached for the pen. With a single, precise movement, the untouchable king signed over his controlling shares, effectively resigning his crown. The board watched in alarmingly still shock as he dismantled his professional life with the same finality he had used to break the elevator doors. "A heart cannot be acquired through a board vote," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that betrayed his internal collapse, but carried a new, authentic truth. By choosing to lose his billion-dollar portfolio, he was finally making a strategic move that mattered. He was trading the glass fortress for a bridge, realizing that being the poorest man in the city with Amara was better than being a king in a hollow empire. He walked out of the boardroom, no longer a controlled king, but a man ready to earn the partnership of the woman who had already changed the standard. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked with a quiet, natural rhythm, finally striking 7:02 p.m. on a Tuesday. 1 week had passed since the glass fortress had shattered, but the air in the penthouse no longer smelled of expensive ozone or filtered rain. Instead, it carried the scent of the city raw, unfiltered, and alive, wafting through the open space where the floor-to-ceiling windows once acted as a cage. There was no modest suitcase waiting by the private elevator, and no modest apron draped over the brushed steel countertops. The appropriate lines of their previous life had been completely erased, replaced by a truth revealed that didn't require a contract or a billion-dollar portfolio to validate. Amara and Jinhyuk stood together on the mezzanine balcony, their silhouettes framed by the sprawling, glittering Seoul skyline. Jinhyuk, no longer the untouchable king or the controlled king obsessed with dominance and obedience, stood with his athletic frame, relaxed, his piercing, intense eyes reflecting a peace he had never known in his hollow empire. Beside him, Amara stood with a calm confidence, her warm skin glowing in the twilight, no longer a ghost or a permanent but invisible fixture of his convenience. They didn't speak. The silence that stretched between them was no longer a wall or a suffocating weight. It was the meaningful silence they had once sought, but this time it was built on a bridge of truth rather than professional distance. Jinhyuk didn't need to use a low, commanding rasp to own the room, and Amara didn't need to withdraw her soul to find her worth. As they watched the lights of the city flicker to life, Jinhyuk reached out, his precise movements softened by a new, authentic vulnerability. He didn't take her hand as a hostile takeover. He held it as a partner. In the sprawling, empty palace that had finally become a home, the man who once thought he owned everything realized he was finally rich. They stood as equals, two people who had survived the internal collapse of their old worlds to build something real in the quiet of the night. Here is the end of this story. If this story moved you, click the like button and subscribe.